The grand clock of Blackwood Manor tolled midnight, the heavy chimes vibrating through the floorboards of the dimly lit corridor. Amber's breath hitched as a large, calloused hand slammed against the oak paneling beside her head, trapping her in the shadows. The scent of rain, sandalwood, and masculine fury enveloped her. His chest heaved, the usually impeccable cravat undone, his piercing gaze stripping away every defense she had meticulously built. He leaned in, his voice a gravelly, desperate whisper that sent a violent shiver down her spine. "Look at me," the Duke growled, his jaw tight with barely restrained agony. "Say you don't love me." The year was 1862, and the relentless London fog clung to the cobblestones of Gower Street like a damp, suffocating shroud. In a freezing, third-floor garret, Amber Whitmore stood before a sprawling canvas, a rag soaked in turpentine gripped tightly in her stained fingers. She was not meant for this life. Only 3 years prior, she had been the toast of the London season, the darling daughter of Sir Reginald Whitmore. But the collapse of the Transpennine Railway speculation had stripped her father of his fortune, his estate, and ultimately, his life. Left with nothing but debts and a society that swiftly turned its back on her, Amber had monetized her only private passion, the restoration of antiquities. She was good at it, too good, perhaps, for a woman in a trade dominated by secretive, guild-minded men, working under the pseudonym C.W. Astley. She had managed to keep herself fed, taking commissions from the city's lesser gentry. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door shattered the quiet of her studio. Before Amber could wipe her hands on her apron, the door swung open, carried by the force of a man who clearly did not wait for invitations. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Westmoreland, seemed to swallow the small room whole. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and impeccably tailored in a dark charcoal frock coat, yet possessing a ruggedness that defied the polished parlors of Mayfair. His reputation preceded him, a ruthless political operator in the House of Lords, an ally to the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, and a man whose cold, unyielding demeanor had earned him the moniker the Iron Duke of the North. "Mr. Astley, I presume?" Arthur's voice was a deep baritone that commanded the air. His striking, dark eyes swept the room, registering the peeling wallpaper, the sparse coal fire, and finally settling on Amber. He frowned, a distinct line forming between his brows. "Where is your employer, girl?" "I am C.W. Astley, Your Grace," Amber replied, lifting her chin. She refused to cower, even as her heart hammered an erratic rhythm against her ribs. "And you are trespassing." Arthur stared at her, a flicker of genuine surprise briefly breaking his stoic facade. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, his gaze trailing over her smudged cheek, the loose tendrils of auburn hair escaping her severe bun, and the defiant set of her jaw. A woman, restoring the Harrington frescoes last month, forging the missing panel of the Earl of Derby's Dutch master? "Not forging, restoring," Amber corrected sharply. "If you have come to debate the propriety of my profession, you may see yourself out." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. He reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy, wax-sealed envelope, tossing it onto her work table. It landed with a dull thud next to a pot of linseed oil. "I do not care about your gender, Miss Astley, only your discretion. I have a canvas at my ancestral estate in Yorkshire, Blackwood Manor. It is a family portrait dating back to the late 17th century. It has suffered severe smoke damage and other indignities. It must be restored within the month, before the annual gathering of the peers." Amber looked at the envelope. "Why me? You have the wealth to hire the Royal Academy's finest." "Because," Arthur stepped closer, his physical presence overwhelming, "the Academy asks questions. The Academy gossips. You, living in a garret, under a false name, cannot afford to do either. You will be paid £500, enough to move out of this squalor." The sum was staggering. It was enough to buy back a modicum of her freedom, perhaps even a small cottage in the country. But the intensity in the Duke's eyes warned her that this was no simple restoration. There was danger woven into his offer. "I will require my own workspace, undisturbed," Amber said, her voice remarkably steady. "You will have the run of the East Wing," Arthur replied, turning toward the door. "My carriage leaves from Grosvenor Square at dawn tomorrow. Do not be late." The journey to Yorkshire was an exercise in agonizing silence. Sitting across from the Duke in his luxurious velvet-lined carriage, Amber was acutely aware of the vast chasm between them. He spent the 3-day journey buried in dispatch boxes and parliamentary reports, his brow furrowed in perpetual concentration. Yet, occasionally, Amber would catch him watching her over the edge of his papers, a dark, unreadable scrutiny that made her skin prickle with an unfamiliar, electric heat. Blackwood Manor rose from the desolate Yorkshire moors like a Gothic fortress, its grey stone towers piercing the stormy sky. It was a place of secrets, echoing with the ghosts of the Pendleton lineage. Upon arrival, Amber was ushered by a tight-lipped housekeeper to a grand, dust-sheeted library where the painting waited. It was massive, spanning 10 feet across. Beneath decades of grime, yellowed varnish, and a heavy layer of soot, Amber could just make out the figures of the previous Duke of Westmoreland, his Duchess, and a young boy, Arthur. But as she ran her practiced fingertips over the canvas, tracing the subtle ridges of the brushstrokes, she felt an anomaly. There was a disruption in the impasto. A thick, clumsy layer of overpaint had been hastily applied near the Duchess's right side. "Find something already?" Amber gasped, spinning around. Arthur was leaning against the heavy mahogany doorframe, having discarded his coat and cravat. The top buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of bronzed skin. In the dim, flickering light of the hearth, he looked less like a duke and more like a predator of the moors. "The canvas has been altered, Your Grace," Amber said, wiping her hands. "Recently, within the last 20 years, someone intentionally painted over a section of this portrait." Arthur's jaw clenched. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He pushed off the doorframe and stalked toward her, stopping mere inches away. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the sharp scent of whiskey on his breath. "Then your task, Miss Astley," he murmured, his voice laced with a dangerous edge, "is to remove the lie. Show me what my father went to his grave trying to hide." For a fortnight, Amber practically lived in the library. The moors outside battered the manor with relentless rain, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Using a delicate mixture of alcohol and turpentine, Amber meticulously worked away the false layer of paint. It was an agonizingly slow process, requiring surgical precision. Arthur became a constant, haunting presence. He would arrive late in the evenings after spending his days managing his sprawling tenant farms or riding his massive black stallion across the moors to exhaustion. He rarely spoke, choosing instead to sit in a wingback chair by the fire, nursing a glass of scotch and watching her. Amber tried to ignore the heavy weight of his stare, but it was impossible. She found herself hyper-aware of her own movements, the arch of her back as she reached for a top corner, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. One evening, as the grandfather clock ticked past 1 in the morning, Amber's scalpel caught the edge of the overpaint. A large flake chipped away, revealing a startlingly clear patch of original color, the vibrant blue fabric of a child's coat, and a small, delicate hand clutching a silver rattle. She stepped back, her breath catching. Arthur was out of his chair in an instant. He stood behind her, so close that his chest brushed against her back. Amber froze, a sudden sharp thrill coursing through her veins at the contact. "A child," Arthur whispered, his voice rough. "Another child. An older brother. Judging by the placement and the style of the clothing," Amber said softly, acutely aware of the warmth of his breath against her neck. "But Your Grace, you are the eldest. The only heir. Evidently not." Arthur's hands came up, hovering over her shoulders for a fraction of a second before he gripped the back of her chair, white-knuckled. "My father always had a shadow hanging over him. Blackmail. Vast sums of money disappearing from the estate accounts. He claimed it was political maneuvering in London. If you had an older, legitimate brother," Amber reasoned, turning slightly to look up at him. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the faint silver scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "Then your claim to the dukedom is void," Arthur finished bitterly. He stared at the newly revealed hand on the canvas. "I would be stripped of everything. My seat in the house, the estate, the title, left an imposter." Amber's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his tone. The Iron Duke was suddenly very human. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it gripped the chair. It was a grave breach of propriety, a scandalous intimacy. Arthur went entirely still. He looked down at her small, pale hand resting on his large, tanned one. Slowly, he turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. His thumb traced the calluses on her palm, a surprisingly gentle caress that made Amber's breath hitch. "You should leave, Amber," he said, using her Christian name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was a dark velvet caress. "When this painting is fully restored, a storm will break. The men who blackmailed my father are still out there. They know what is under this paint, and they are waiting for me to uncover it, so they can extort me." "I do not run from storms, Arthur," she whispered, matching his informality. His eyes darkened, dropping to her lips. The air between them grew impossibly thick, crackling with an undeniable, consuming tension. He leaned in, his gaze burning with a sudden, fierce hunger. Amber tilted her head, her eyes fluttering shut, anticipating the crash of his mouth against hers. A loud crash of a log breaking in the fireplace shattered the moment. Arthur pulled back violently, as if burned. He ran a hand through his hair, his chest heaving, the mask of the cold, aloof Duke slamming back into place. "Finish the work, Miss Whitmore," he said coldly, turning his back on her. "And keep your door locked at night." He strode out of the library, leaving Amber trembling, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, completely, utterly consumed by a man she was forbidden to want. By the end of the third week, the truth was fully unmasked. The painting revealed a strikingly handsome older boy standing beside the Duchess. But the most damning detail was the silver rattle the boy held. It bore the crest of the Cavendish family. Arthur stared at the restored canvas, his face pale. "My mother. She was betrothed to a Cavendish before she married my father. A scandalous affair was rumoured, but hushed up. This boy, he is a Cavendish bastard. Passed off as a Pendleton for years, until my father discovered the truth, had the boy sent away, and painted him out of history." "Which means," Amber said quietly, "your title is secure. You are the true heir. The blackmailer's threat is entirely baseless." "Unless," Arthur said, a deadly calm settling over him, "the blackmailer is the boy himself, grown up, seeking the inheritance he believes is his. We must return to London." London was in the throes of the spring season. The mourning period for Prince Albert had slightly eased, and society was desperate for distraction. Amber found herself installed in a lavish suite in the Duke's Mayfair townhouse. Arthur had insisted she remain under his protection, ostensibly until the threat was neutralized, but Amber secretly hoped it was because he couldn't bear to let her go. To society, Amber was introduced as a distant cousin of the Duke's aunt, Lady Agatha, a formidable dowager who agreed to chaperone Amber only after Arthur threatened to cut off her allowance. Despite her fine new silk gowns and the Westmoreland carriage at her disposal, the whispers followed Amber everywhere. The Ton had a long memory. They remembered the ruined daughter of Sir Reginald Whitmore. The political climate was equally volatile. Arthur was pushing a controversial land reform bill through Parliament, making him powerful enemies. The climax of the social calendar was the Duchess of Sutherland's masquerade ball at Stafford House. The ballroom was a sea of glittering jewels, feathered masks, and suffocating hypocrisy. Amber, wearing a gown of midnight blue silk and a silver half-mask, felt entirely out of place. She scanned the crowd for Arthur, who was trapped in a conversation with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. "You look remarkably well for a woman whose father died a penniless disgrace, Miss Whitmore." Amber stiffened. A man stepped out from behind a marble pillar. He was elegantly dressed, wearing a gilded domino mask, but she recognized the sneering drawl immediately. Lord Thomas Sterling. He was a rising star in the opposing political faction, a man known for his cruel wit and his massive gambling debts. "Lord Sterling," Amber said, keeping her voice even, "I see you are still hiding behind masks, both literal and metaphorical." Sterling chuckled, a dry, venomous sound. He stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her back toward the heavy velvet curtains of the terrace doors. "And I see you have found yourself a very wealthy, very powerful protector. Tell me, does the Iron Duke know he's harboring a thief's daughter? Or do your private services compensate for your lack of pedigree?" Amber slapped him. The crack echoed sharply in the small alcove. Sterling's eyes flared with rage. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. "You little whore," he hissed. "You think you are safe because you sleep in his house? I know what you uncovered at Blackwood. I know about the bastard Cavendish. My associates and I have been bleeding the old Duke dry for years." Amber's blood ran cold. He was the blackmailer. Sterling was behind it all. "You have nothing," Amber spat, struggling against his grip. "The painting proves the child was a bastard. Arthur's claim is absolute." Sterling smiled, revealing perfect, predatory teeth. "Oh, my dear, the painting doesn't prove Arthur is the legitimate one. The documents I possess show that the old Duke was sterile. Neither boy was his. Arthur is just as much a bastard as the other. And I am going to ruin him, right after I ruin you." Before Amber could cry out, the curtain was violently torn back. Arthur stood there, looking like an avenging god. His mask was gone, his eyes blazing with a murderous, unhinged fury Amber had never seen before. He didn't speak. He simply lunged, his large hand wrapped around Sterling's throat, lifting the aristocrat off his feet and slamming him into the marble pillar. Sterling gasped, his hands clawing uselessly at Arthur's iron grip. "Arthur, stop! You'll kill him!" Amber screamed, grabbing the Duke's arm. Arthur threw Sterling to the floor like a piece of garbage. "If you ever come near her again, Sterling, I will not just ruin you in the House of Lords. I will bury you in the moors." Arthur snarled, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. He grabbed Amber's hand, his grip tight, and dragged her through the bewildered crowd, out of the ballroom, and into the cool night air. He shoved her into the waiting carriage, barking a harsh order at the driver. Inside the carriage, the air was suffocatingly tense. Arthur was a coiled spring, staring out the window, his jaw clenched so hard, Amber thought it might snap. "Arthur," Amber began, her voice trembling. "He knows. Sterling is the one who—" "I know who he is," Arthur roared, slamming his fist against the carriage wall. Amber flinched. He turned to her, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and terror. Not terror for himself, she realized with a jolt. Terror for her. "I told you it was dangerous," he gritted out, the carriage violently swaying as it sped over the cobblestones. "I told you to stay away from me. I am surrounded by vipers, Amber, and now they are looking at you. I am not afraid of them." Amber fired back, her own temper flaring. "I am not some fragile debutante who needs to be hidden away. I choose to be here. I choose you." Arthur stared at her, breathing heavily. The carriage lurched to a halt in front of his townhouse. He didn't wait for the footman. He threw open the door, practically pulled Amber out, and marched her up the steps, past the shocked butler, and into the darkened foyer. He didn't stop until they reached the shadowy corridor outside his study. He spun her around, his large, calloused hand slamming against the oak paneling beside her head, trapping her against the wall. The scent of rain, sandalwood, and masculine fury enveloped her. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, stripping away every defense she had meticulously built. His voice was a gravelly, desperate whisper that sent a violent shiver down her spine. "Look at me," the Duke growled, his jaw tight with barely restrained agony. "Say you don't love me." The silence in the corridor was absolute, save for the ragged sound of their breathing. Amber stared up at the Duke of Westmoreland, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim gaslight from the foyer. The demand hung between them. "Say you don't love me." A desperate plea from a man who had been taught that love was a weakness to be exploited. Amber's pulse drummed in her throat. She looked into his dark, tortured eyes, seeing past the ruthless politician, past the Iron Duke, to the man who was terrified of dragging her into his ruin. "I cannot," Amber whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. She raised a stained, calloused hand and pressed it flat against his thundering chest, feeling the heat of him through his fine linen shirt. "I cannot say it, Arthur, because it would be a lie." A low, guttural sound tore from Arthur's throat. The last of his formidable restraint shattered. He crushed his mouth down on hers, not with the gentle reverence of a courtier, but with the starving, desperate hunger of a condemned man. His hands tangled in her auburn hair, the pins scattering across the hardwood floor as he dragged her flush against him. Amber gasped into his mouth, winding her arms around his neck, meeting his fierce passion with an equally reckless fire. The kiss was a collision of two worlds, the disgraced restorer and the besieged peer, anchored only by the sudden, undeniable certainty that they belonged to each other. When Arthur finally pulled away, resting his forehead against hers, his hands were shaking. He closed his eyes, his breathing heavy. "You are a fool, Amber Whitmore," he murmured, though the words were laced with profound tenderness. Sterling will not stop. If his claims are true, if my father truly left behind a medical record proving his sterility, I am nothing, a nameless bastard squatting in a dukedom. Then we must find the truth before he can sell his lies to the highest bidder, Amber said, her analytical mind already racing. She stepped back, straightening her bodice, her eyes fiercely bright. If your father kept such damning documents, where would they be? Arthur straightened, running a hand through his disheveled hair, the statesman slowly returning. Not here, and not at Blackwood. He trusted very few men, but he did have a private solicitor separate from the family's primary estate managers. A man named Silas Thorne. No, excuse me, Silas Penhaligon, a quiet man who kept an office near Lincoln's Inn Fields. He led her into his private study, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind them. Lighting a single oil lamp, Arthur moved to a concealed safe behind a row of encyclopedias. He withdrew a stack of bound leather ledgers. I found these shortly after my father died, Arthur explained, spreading them across the desk. They are his private accounts. I could never make sense of the erratic pace. Look here. Amber leaned over the desk. The entries were scrawled in a frantic, spidery hand. 14th May, 1,845. Payment to T.S. £500. For silence. Regarding the Cavendish matter. 2nd August, 1,848. Payment to Dr. W. Jenner, £150. Consultation and discretion. 10th November, 1,850. Farrer & Co., £300. Holding fee for the Penhaligon vault. Dr. William Jenner, Amber breathed, recognizing the name of the renowned physician who attended to the royal family. And Farrer & Co., that is a highly respectable firm. Why would he pay them a holding fee for a vault belonging to Penhaligon? Because Penhaligon died in 1849, Arthur realized, his eyes narrowing. My father must have transferred his most volatile secrets to a secure vault at Farrer & Co. to keep them out of the hands of the blackmailer. T.S. Thomas Sterling, or rather, Sterling's father, the previous Viscount. It is a generational extortion. If the documents in that vault prove your father was sterile, Sterling will use them to petition the Crown to strip you of your title and seize your assets, Amber said, the gravity of the situation settling over her. But what if they prove the opposite? What if Dr. Jenner's consultation confirmed your father could sire an heir, and the only bastard was the Cavendish boy? Arthur looked at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Tomorrow morning we visit Farrer & Co. We will open the Penhaligon vault. A heavy, suffocating drizzle coated London the next morning as the unmarked carriage pulled up to the austere stone facade of Farrer & Co. in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Arthur had dressed in plain, dark clothing, foregoing his usual aristocratic finery, while Amber wore a heavy wool cloak that concealed her features. The interior of the law firm smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and generations of guarded secrets. They were shown into a private, wood-paneled office by a junior clerk, who looked terrified of Arthur's imposing presence. Presently, a senior partner, Mr. Josiah Higgins, entered. He was a small, meticulous man, with spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. Your Grace, Higgins bowed stiffly. It is highly unusual for you to request access to the Penhaligon vault. It has been sealed for over a decade. By my father's orders, Arthur said smoothly, his voice leaving no room for argument. And as his heir, I am unsealing it. Bring me the contents, Mr. Higgins. Now. 10 agonizing minutes later, Higgins returned carrying a single, brass-bound lockbox. He placed it on the desk, handed Arthur a heavy iron key, and discreetly bowed himself out of the room. Arthur stared at the box. His entire life, his legacy, and his future with Amber rested on whatever lay inside. He inserted the key. The lock turned with a sharp, echoing click. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded black ribbon and a sealed medical report bearing the crest of Sir William Jenner. Arthur broke the wax seal on the report, his hands unusually clumsy. Amber stood beside him, holding her breath as he read the crisp, clinical script. Arthur's shoulders, tense as coiled springs, suddenly dropped. A harsh, disbelieving laugh escaped his lips. "Read it," he said, pushing the paper toward her. Amber's eyes scanned the document. Asterisk, patient, the 6th Duke of Westmoreland. Asterisk date of examination, August 1st, 1848. Asterisk. Findings. Upon thorough examination, I find His Grace to be in robust health and fully capable of siring offspring. The rumors of his sterility, circulated by malicious parties within the ton, are medically unfounded and entirely false. However, His Grace suffers from a severe bout of melancholia regarding the infidelity of his Duchess. He wasn't sterile, Amber gasped, looking up at Arthur with a brilliant, relieved smile. You are the true heir. Sterling's claim is built on a lie his father fabricated to extort yours. My father paid them to keep the rumor quiet, fearing the scandal of my mother's affair with Cavendish would destroy the family name, Arthur said, his eyes darkening with sudden, fierce resolve. He bought his own blackmail out of pride, but Sterling has overplayed his hand. Arthur gathered the documents, placing them securely in the inner pocket of his coat. We have the proof. I'm going to take this directly to the Prime Minister. Sterling's political career and his freedom will end today. They left the quiet sanctuary of the law firm, stepping back out into the dreary London afternoon. But as they turned down a narrow, cobbled alleyway leading toward Temple Bar to reach their carriage, a chilling sound echoed off the brick walls, the heavy thud of boots. 4 men stepped out from the fog, blocking their path. They were rough-looking characters, dock workers or hired muscle from the rookeries, armed with heavy wooden cudgels. From behind them, Lord Sterling emerged, his aristocratic face twisted into an ugly, desperate sneer. Did you really think I wouldn't have you followed, Westmoreland? Sterling drawled, drawing a silver-pommeled cane from his side. I need those papers. My creditors are growing impatient, and your estate is the only thing that will save my neck. Arthur pushed Amber behind him, his stance widening into that of a seasoned brawler. You will hang for this, Sterling. Only if I leave witnesses, Sterling replied coldly. He snapped his fingers. Kill him. Take the girl to the river. The thugs surged forward. Arthur moved with terrifying speed. He caught the first man's arm, twisting it until a sickening crack echoed through the alley, and used the man's body as a shield against the second attacker. The alley erupted into brutal, chaotic violence. Arthur fought like a demon, his fists landing with devastating force, but he was outnumbered. A third thug slipped past Arthur, lunging toward Amber with a rusted knife. Amber didn't scream. Her life in the garret had taught her survival. She reached into her cloak, her fingers closing around a heavy, glass bottle of acidic solvent she always carried for emergency restorations. As the man lunged, she smashed the bottle violently against the brick wall and hurled the corrosive liquid directly into his face. The man shrieked, dropping his knife and clawing at his eyes as he collapsed to the cobblestones. Arthur used the distraction to deliver a crushing blow to the jaw of the last thug, sending him unconscious to the ground. He whirled around, chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut above his eye, and fixed a murderous glare on Sterling. Sterling, suddenly alone and facing a furious, bloody Duke, dropped his cane. He took a terrified step back, raising his hands. Arthur, be reasonable. Arthur crossed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't bother speaking. He drove his fist into Sterling's stomach, doubling the Viscount over, and followed it with a brutal uppercut that sent Sterling crashing into the muddy gutters of Temple Bar, out cold. Breathing heavily, Arthur turned back to Amber. He looked at the shattered glass, the screaming man on the ground, and then at Amber, who stood trembling but completely unhurt. He crossed the alley, pulling her fiercely into his arms, burying his face in her neck. Are you all right? He rasped, his voice rough with adrenaline and terror. I am fine, Amber breathed, clinging to him, the reality of the violence crashing over her. You have the papers? Arthur patted his breast pocket. I have them. It is finished. He pulled back, wiping a smear of mud from her cheek with a gentle thumb, his eyes burning with a mixture of awe and absolute devotion. Remind me never to cross a restorer of antiquities. Amber managed a weak, watery laugh. Take me home, Arthur. The heavy oak doors of 10 Downing Street closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing Arthur and the Prime Minister inside the private office. Lord Palmerston, a man whose political cunning had shaped the British Empire for decades, sat behind his massive mahogany desk. His sharp, aged eyes scanned the documents Arthur had laid before him, the authentic medical report from Sir William Jenner and the damning ledger of extortion spanning a generation. Arthur stood by the window, gazing out at the grim London drizzle, his knuckles still raw and bruised from the alleyway brawl. He had sent Amber back to the Mayfair townhouse under the heavy guard of his most trusted men, refusing to leave her side until she was safely locked within its walls. "This is a profound revelation, Westmoreland," Palmerston murmured, his voice a dry rasp that commanded absolute authority. He carefully set the papers down and adjusted his spectacles. "Lord Stirling's father was a known gambler, but this is systemic blackmail against a Duke of the Realm. And young Thomas attempted to murder you in Temple Bar to cover it up." "He cornered us with hired thugs, Prime Minister," Arthur said, his voice cold as the North Sea. "He intended to leave my body in the gutters and throw Miss Whitmore into the Thames. I want him arrested. I want him stripped of his seat, his lands seized for the debts he owes the Crown, and I want him sent to Newgate." Palmerston steepled his fingers, leaning back in his leather chair. "The Metropolitan Police will have a warrant for his arrest before the hour is out. Attempted murder of a peer, extortion, and high treason against the stability of the House of Lords. Stirling will swing, or spend the rest of his miserable life breaking rocks in Australia. You have my word." Arthur nodded sharply, but the Prime Minister was not finished. "However," Palmerston continued, his gaze piercing, "there is the matter of your companion, Miss Amber Whitmore." "The tongue is already whispering, Arthur. The ruined daughter of Sir Reginald Whitmore, living under your roof, accompanying you to a solicitor's vault, and now involved in a street brawl. You are pushing a controversial land reform bill through Parliament. Your enemies will use her to destroy your credibility. They will say the Iron Duke has lost his senses over a destitute painter. Let them say what they will," Arthur growled, stepping away from the window, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the Prime Minister's carpet. "My private life is my own." "You are a duke, Arthur. You have no private life," Palmerston countered, not unkindly. "Send the girl away. Pay her handsomely, set her up in a cottage in Cornwall or Paris, but sever the tie. If you marry her, society will turn its back on you. You will be a pariah in your own house. Then the house can burn," Arthur stated softly, turning on his heel. "Good day, Prime Minister." By evening, the scandal had broken with the force of a tempest. The Metropolitan Police had dragged Lord Stirling from his gentleman's club in Street, James's, hauling him out in irons as his peers watched in stunned silence. But Stirling, cornered and venomous, fired one last, desperate shot from his cell in Newgate. He gave an interview to a sensationalist reporter from the Morning Chronicle. The next morning, the headlines screamed from every newsstand in London: "The Duke and the Destitute Daughter. Forgery, fraud, and fornication in Mayfair. Lord Stirling, imprisoned on false charges as the Duke of Westmoreland, harbours ruined heiress Amber Whitmore." In the breakfast room of the Westmoreland townhouse, Amber stared at the ink-stained broadsheet, her heart sinking like a stone in a frozen pond. The article laid bare every painful detail of her past: her father's bankruptcy, his suicide, her clandestine life in a Gower Street garret, and crude speculations about her current arrangements with the Duke. Lady Agatha, Arthur's formidable aunt, sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, her aristocratic face pale with fury. She slammed her teacup into its saucer, the fine bone china rattling. "It is a disaster," Lady Agatha proclaimed, glaring at the newspaper. "We are ruined. The Westmoreland name is dragged through the muck. We will not be received anywhere. Queen Victoria herself will strike us from the royal enclosure at Ascot." Amber slowly lowered the paper, her hands trembling. She had survived poverty, cold, and starvation, but she could not survive being the anchor that drowned the man she loved. "I will pack my things, Lady Agatha. I will leave before noon." "You will do no such thing." Arthur's voice boomed from the doorway. He strode into the room, impeccably dressed in a dark morning coat, but his eyes were bloodshot from a sleepless night. He snatched the newspaper from the table and tossed it directly into the roaring fireplace. "Arthur, you must see reason," Lady Agatha pleaded, rising to her feet. "She is a sweet girl, but she is social poison. The scandal is a temporary storm whipped up by a desperate, imprisoned man," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, commanding register. He walked to Amber's side, placing a heavy, warm hand on her trembling shoulder. "Miss Whitmore stays, and if any member of society has a single disparaging word to say about her, they will answer to me. "You cannot fight all of London, Arthur," his aunt cried. "Watch me," he replied. He looked down at Amber, his thumb gently brushing against the high collar of her dress. "Come with me to the study, Amber." Once the heavy doors were shut, Arthur turned to her, the stern facade melting away, leaving only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, velvet box. "Arthur, no," Amber whispered, backing away, tears stinging her eyes. "You heard the Prime Minister. You saw the papers. I am a ruin. I am a scandal. If you tie yourself to me, everything you have worked for your reforms, your legacy will turn to ash." "My legacy is meaningless without you," Arthur said, stepping closer, trapping her gently against the edge of his desk. He opened the box. Inside rested a massive, flawlessly cut sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds. It was the Westmoreland betrothal ring, an heirloom that had belonged to the duchesses of his line for 3 centuries. When I looked at that painting at Blackwood, I saw a history built on lies, fear, and blackmail, Arthur murmured, his eyes locking onto hers, burning with an intensity that took her breath away. "When I look at you, Amber, I see the only truth I have ever cared about. Marry me. Let them whisper. Let them stare. I do not care about the House of Lords. I only care about you." Amber squeezed her eyes shut, a tear slipping down her cheek. She loved him so fiercely, it physically ached. But true love meant sacrifice. "I cannot let you destroy yourself for me," she choked out. She ducked under his arm, fleeing the study before she could break, leaving Arthur standing alone with the ring glittering in the dim light. The dawn sky over London was the color of bruised iron, weeping a relentless, chilling drizzle that soaked through the heavy wool of Amber's cloak. She slipped out the servants' entrance of the Westmoreland townhouse, a solitary ghost, fleeing the only home she had ever truly known. In her gloved hand, she gripped the worn leather handle of a small carpet bag containing her meager savings, a few changes of clothes, and her essential palette knives. She had left the sapphire ring untouched on the mahogany desk in Arthur's study. Beside it rested a tear-stained note that had felt like tearing her own heart from her chest to write, "I love you enough to disappear. Do not look for me." The hired hackney carriage rattled over the wet cobblestones, each violent jolt a physical ache in her chest. Amber stared out the rain-streaked window, watching the grand, imposing facades of Mayfair gradually give way to the grim, smoke-choked sprawl of the industrial city. She was doing the right thing. She repeated the desperate mantra in her head with every rotation of the carriage wheels. Arthur was a duke, a man destined to shape the future of the empire. She was the destitute daughter of a ruined man, a walking scandal waiting to consume him. Lord Palmerston had been right. Lady Agatha had been right. If Arthur tied himself to her, the vipers of the Tun would tear him apart with their vicious gossip. He would lose his controversial land reform bill, his hard-won political influence, perhaps even his ancestral seat in the House of Lords. She could not be the architect of his destruction, not when she loved him with a desperation that stole the very breath from her lungs. King's Cross Station was a cathedral of iron and steam, a chaotic purgatory of shouting porters, weeping families, and the deafening hiss of the great locomotives. Amber paid the driver, pulling the hood of her cloak deep over her face to hide her tears. The air inside the station tasted of sulphur and damp wool. She joined the long queue for the ticket office, her hands trembling so violently she dropped her coins twice before managing to purchase a third-class fare to Edinburgh. From there, she would find a mail coach deep into the Scottish Highlands. She would change her name again. She would become a shadow. The massive black engine of the Flying Scotsman idled heavily at platform 4, venting great plumes of white steam into the vaulted glass ceiling above. Amber stood near the third-class carriages, the throng of travellers pressing in around her. The whistle blew a sharp, mournful shriek that echoed the violent fracturing of her own soul. The conductor began marching down the line, shouting for final boarding. Amber picked up her bag. Her boots felt like lead. She took one step toward the open carriage door, then another. She closed her eyes, summoning the vivid image of Arthur's face, the gold flecks in his dark, stormy eyes, the harsh, unforgiving line of his jaw, the surprising tenderness of his calloused hands. She memorized it, locking it away in the deepest vault of her heart, a treasure she would fiercely guard until her dying breath. "Amber!" The voice cut through the deafening cacophony of the station like a cannon shot. Amber froze her. The breath seized in her throat. She told herself it was an auditory hallucination, a cruel trick played by a grieving, exhausted mind. She tightened her grip on her bag and took another agonizing step toward the train. Amber Whitmore, do not take another step. She turned slowly, her heart slamming violently against her ribs. Arthur was tearing through the dense crowd of Platform 4. He had clearly not bothered with a carriage. He had ridden his black stallion directly into the city. He was breathless, his dark hair wildly disheveled by the wind, his usually immaculate morning coat speckled with mud and rain. He shoved past a group of indignant businessmen and practically leapt over a porter's cart. His eyes locked onto her with a terrifying, predatory focus. He looked wild. He looked unhinged. He looked utterly magnificent. He reached her just as the train lurched forward, its massive iron wheels groaning in protest. He did not speak. He simply reached out, his large hands wrapping around her waist, and physically hoisted her away from the edge of the platform. He set her down and immediately pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Amber dropped her carpetbag, her hands instinctively coming up to clutch at his wet lapels. He was trembling. The Iron Duke, the most formidable man in Parliament, was shaking like a leaf in a winter gale. "Did you honestly believe," Arthur panted, his breath hot against her chilled skin, "that after spending my entire life fighting ghosts in the dark, I would let the only light I have ever known vanish on a train to Scotland?" "Arthur, please," Amber sobbed, trying weakly to push against his solid chest, though her body betrayed her, craving his warmth. "You must let me go. You saw the papers. You know what they are saying about me. I am a ruin. The scandal will spread like a contagion. They will strip you of your power. They will say, you are compromised, mad. Damn the papers, damn the ton, damn Parliament." Arthur roared, his deep baritone echoing over the hiss of the train, silencing a dozen onlookers who immediately turned to stare. He pulled back slightly, framing her tear-streaked face in his large hands, his thumbs aggressively wiping away her tears. "I do not care about power, Amber. I do not care about a society built on the very hypocrisy we have just dismantled. I care about you. Only you. You cannot sacrifice your life for me," she cried out, the agony of the choice tearing her apart. "I won't let you. It is not a sacrifice. It is my salvation," he fiercely countered. He took a deep, stabilizing breath, his dark eyes boring into hers. "Listen to me. You are not a scandal, Amber. You are a victim of the same vipers who tried to destroy my family. After you fled the townhouse this morning, I realized I could not just arrest Sterling. I had to understand the genesis of his father's extortion. I went to the Bow Street archives with Palmerston's men. I cross-referenced the late Viscount Sterling's financial records with the extortion payments in my father's ledgers." Amber stopped struggling, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a tense, vibrating register. "Where do you think the previous Viscount Sterling acquired the massive initial capital required to bribe clerks, forge documents, and build a blackmail empire vast enough to threaten a duke?" Amber shook her head, unable to comprehend. "The Transpennine Railway speculation," Arthur revealed, the words landing like physical blows. Amber gasped, her eyes widening in sheer shock. "Your father did not fail, Amber," Arthur continued, his voice fierce with righteous anger on her behalf. "Sir Reginald Whitmore was an honourable man. He was pushed. Viscount Sterling orchestrated the collapse of the speculation. He stole the investors' funds, drove your father to ruin, and used that stolen wealth to buy the silence of my family and dozens of others. Your father was not a reckless fool. He was the innocent casualty of the very men who tried to steal my birthright." The world tilted violently on its axis. The soot-stained glass of the station roof seemed to spin above her. The shame that had cloaked Amber for 3 long, agonizing years, the shame that had driven her into a freezing garret, the shame that made her believe she was unworthy of the man holding her shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. Her father had been a mark, a victim. "You are not a ruined daughter," Arthur said softly, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "You are the heir to a stolen legacy. And I swear to you on my life, Amber, I will see every penny return to your name, even if I have to tear the Sterling estate down to its foundations and sell the bricks." Amber stared at him, tears of vindication and overwhelming love spilling hot down her cheeks. The ghosts of her past, the heavy, suffocating burdens she had carried alone, evaporated in the heat of his absolute devotion. Arthur stepped back. Right there, amidst the soot, the puddles of dirty rainwater, and the gawking crowd of third-class passengers and porters, the Duke of Westmoreland dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A woman in a feathered hat dropped her parasol. A conductor paused mid-shout. Arthur ignored them all. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the velvet box he had shown her in his study. He snapped it open, the flawless, antique sapphire catching the harsh light of the station, a defiant spark of blue fire against the grey morning. "Amber Whitmore," Arthur declared, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity, stripped of all aristocratic pretense and filled only with raw, unyielding truth. "I have spent my life guarding a masterpiece painted over with lies, but you are the only masterpiece I will ever need. You stripped away the falsehoods of my legacy, and in doing so, you bared my soul." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with a vulnerability he reserved for her alone. "Marry me. Let them whisper. Let them stare. Let us paint a new history together, one built not on the fears of our fathers, but on a love they could never comprehend." Amber looked down at the man who had terrified her in a Gower Street garret, the man who had fought like a demon in a dark alley to protect her, the man who was currently ruining his impeccable trousers on a filthy railway platform just to prove she was his world. She threw her hood back, letting her auburn hair tumble free. "Yes," Amber whispered, her voice breaking with absolute joy. She reached out to him. "Yes, Arthur. 1,000 times, yes." Arthur practically vaulted to his feet. He slid the heavy, cold sapphire onto her trembling finger, then swept her into his arms, lifting her clean off the ground. He crushed his mouth against hers, kissing her with a desperate, all-consuming passion that left the entire platform in a stunned, breathless silence. The Iron Duke had fallen, and in his place stood a man completely, irrevocably conquered. And Amber knew, as the train to Edinburgh pulled away without her, that she was finally, truly home. The portrait of the 6th Duke of Westmoreland now hung proudly in the grand gallery of Blackwood Manor, fully restored. Yet it was the painting directly beside it that drew the eye of every visitor. It was a masterpiece of modern portraiture, depicting Arthur, the 7th Duke, standing tall and fiercely protective behind his Duchess, Amber. There were no false layers, no hidden shadows, only the undeniable truth of a profound, hard-won love. Lord Stirling had been sentenced to life in the penal colonies, his family's ill-gotten wealth seized and rightfully restored to the Whitmore estate. The Ton had gossiped, raged, and eventually bowed to the indomitable will of the Iron Duke and his brilliant, defiant wife. Amber had not just restored a canvas, she had restored a man's soul, proving that while history may be painted by the victors, the future is always sculpted by the brave.